why his death was so shocking to the Russian bureaucracy.
If Putin is angry and he wants blood, there will be blood and there is no escape.
What does it tell us about those terrible tensions inside?
Do we know what the new rules are?
Vladimir Putin is the law and he is the rules.
Welcome to the Carnegie Politica podcast. I'm Alex Gabuev, director of Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin. Today's episode is dedicated to the state of mind of the Russian elite in year 4 of the war against Ukraine. On July 7th, the Russian bureaucracy was shaken by news. Hours after being dismissed as a transportation minister, Roman Starovoit, powerful and experienced insider of the Kremlin, was found dead in a park near the elite Rublyovka Avenue, where Russia's rich and powerful reside. As it turned out, Starovoit has taken his own life. It is the first suicide for a cabinet minister in the history of Russia since 1991. Starovoit was dismissed because of an embezzlement case around fortification building in Kursk region, an area that was occupied by Ukrainian armed forces in summer 2024, and which took Russia humiliating 9 months to claim back. Starovoit's suicide is a powerful demonstration that the rules of the game for the Russian elite that existed before the war are now gone. But are there any new rules? Does this incident mean that the Russian elite politics is setting the clock back to Stalin's era? How are senior Russian officials and oligarchs coping with the new state of affairs? I discussed it with independent journalists Farida Rustamova and Margarita Liutova, authors of a new English language newsletter, Faridaily. Before going into exile in March 2022, Farida and Margarita have worked for some of the best independent media in Russia, including Vedomosti, RBK, TV Rain, Meduza, and Russian service of the BBC. It's great to be with you, Farida. Hi.
Hi, Sasha. Good to be here.
And great to have you, Margarita, as well. Hi, Margarita.
Hi, Sasha. Thank you for having me.
Perfect. Before we jump into the conversation, I want to remind everybody that we will very much appreciate if you could hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you are receiving your podcast. We are very eager to hear your feedback, so don't forget to leave us your comment, and then off we go. I think that suicide of a minister is something that's really very rare in Russia. It's very rare in every country and is really unprecedented since Russia's independence. We had some high-level suicides during the Soviet era, definitely. A lot of them happened on Stalin's watch. Some of them have happened in the 80s. But in independent Russia, I don't remember any single case of a cabinet-level official taking his or her, but mostly his life. So probably lower level figures in the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior on Putin's watch, but not much more. So first of all, both of you still talk to a lot of members of the Russian elite, including people that are currently in the government. How do they react? What do they say to Starovoit's suicide? Farida, let me start with you.
Well, shock and terror, those were the feelings, I would say. The people who I spoke to shared. Almost all of them are Starovoit's former colleagues, and most of them knew him pretty well. And definitely met him on some meetings, government meetings, etc. I mean, it's really an extraordinary event on so many levels. Even the way that he was fired was, already disturbing, because Putin's decree came out first thing in the morning on Monday, and it was obvious that it's a humiliating dismissal, and everyone understood that it meant the end of his long and pretty successful career. And it also signaled that Starovoit was truly like days or maybe even hours away from the arrest on corruption charges. The criminal case started in November last year, and it was the threat that he's going to be charged too, just as members of his team, and when he worked as the head of Kursk region, it was an imminent threat. But still, no one expected that. A federal minister shooting himself hours after being fired by Putin. He also killed himself in Rublyovka suburb, which is remarkable too, because it is a home to many Russian top officials, including Putin himself. He has a residence there. So the sense of shock was really palpable, and not just because it was a human tragedy, but also because this kind of behavior seemed to break the rules of the game, because you kind of expected to, if you're a top official and you're fired and there's the threat that you're going to be charged of corruption, you kind of have to obey and stand trial and go to jail. But Starovoit took his fate into his own hands, and this is really extremely rare, and few of our sources, they understood this act as an act of disobedience, as an act of some form of protest. And they told us that he was probably trying to protect his honor and that he left undefeated. I mean, those are rare words. You cannot hear those words like really often, about the actions of some members of Russian system. So, yeah, that was a clear shock and clear horror, because a lot of people compared, of course, it's inevitable, they compared themselves to him.
Margarita, you've worked an economic reporter in Vedomosti, starting 15 years ago. And back then it was a paragon of quality journalism. I'm speaking as somebody who is coming from rivaling team, having worked for Kommersant and checking your newspaper every day of the stories where you had scoops and we didn't have. But you were covering the Russian government, the economic polity. I don't know whether your paths with Roman Starovoit have ever crossed in your reporting life. So what could be the reason for a man of such importance and, as Farida said, really a pretty successful career, like a minister in his early 50s, a governor before that, powerful head of a very important government body, Rosavtodor, that's in charge of building and repairing all of the roads in Russia, large budgets. Like, why would this guy take his own life?
So naturally, we can never know for sure, like what exactly drove Starovoit to this terrible decision, like what state of mind he was in, what exactly made his life feel so unbearable to him. Was it the fear of this Stalin-style prison sentence? Was it like the disgrace, the shame that it could bring on him or his family? Maybe I'll try to emphasize something that we do know about him, and actually our paths indeed crossed. I met Starovoit personally a couple of times back in his Rosavtodor days. So he headed Rosavtodor from 2012 to 2019 almost. And I think what we do know about him maybe helps to explain why his death was so shocking to the Russian bureaucracy, so unsettling. So to my mind, from what I know about him, Starovoit was kind of the textbook example, the epitome of what we call in Russia efficient technocrats. Sometimes they're called the young technocrats. Some of them are not so young. So let us put it like efficient technocrats. So the guys that know how to get things done, the guys that implement policies, and the guys that are trying to make like Russian economy, all the sectors of it work. So back in the days when Starovoit was the head of Rosavtodor, he was really seen as someone who like understands the system. He knew how to operate within the system. He knew how to navigate the system. Let us remember that before Rosavtodor, Starovoit spent 2 years in the Russian government, in the government apparatus. This is the department that is like the internal engine room of the government. So the guys in the apparatus see all the documents, prepare them, and they actually learn a lot about like the inner workings of this governmental system. So Starovoit knew how to operate within it, and he also knew how to kind of blend in this bureaucratic class. And blending in also meant some rather lavish lifestyle, with the luxurious apartments, some glamorous parties. But actually, above all, he was known as someone who can kind of deliver, who can get the things done and get those things done exactly the way the bosses want them to be done. Like the bosses being the minister, the prime minister, or Rothenbergs, whom I think we'll come to. And so what I mean here is like Starovoit did not seem to be the type who would act carelessly or recklessly, like not the kind of person who would attract the attention of the security forces. And certainly not someone you would expect to be so desperate and actually so determined so to end his own life, to take his own life. Possibly as a protest, as Farida mentioned, as some bureaucrats are now putting it, possibly as this protest against the fate that was predetermined for him by the security services. And I think that's part of what makes this event, the suicide, especially disturbing to the elites. Not only because this is the suicide, which is always disturbing, not only because this is the human tragedy, someone they personally knew is deceased, but like if Starovoit, this epitome of technocrat, broke under the pressure, someone so like he was someone so stable, so like inside the system. So what does it tell us about those terrible tensions inside? Like what is the degree, what is the temperature inside? That's appalling here.
You mentioned Rothenberg brothers, and I think that that's the question that bothers me a lot. Like Starovoit was somebody who knew these two brothers, Arkady and Boris, who've been pals of Vladimir Putin since his very early days in then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. Judo partners, some of the most powerful and wealthy people in Putin's Russia, notorious in their ambition to expand their business empire. And definitely in the system that we all know well, you operate as a senior official or manager of a state-owned company, having somebody at the top who is your partner, or as we say, krysha, right? Your bureaucratic, political cover. So Rothenbergs, to me, seem a very powerful krysha. And probably if there is something that the security services are unhappy about, you go to jail, and then your patron manages that your time in prison is actually a pretty nice one. Well, given the prison conditions, but nevertheless, like you're not in a horrible torturing conditions. And then you are pardoned early on and spend kind of 4 years behind the bars. There are examples where this bureaucratic patron, the krysha, is extremely weak. For example, former President Dmitry Medvedev seems to be a pretty bad krysha, like people in his orbit, like Magomedov brothers, who are spending like really notorious terms for corruption in jail, or former Minister Mikhail Abizov, who is spending his time in pretty bad conditions. But Rothenbergs, I think, belong to the people who would be viewed by the elite as powerful patrons. And this time around, it seems that they were not able to protect their own men. So what has changed? Is it Rothenbergs cannot deliver? Or is it something between Rothenbergs and Starovoit that we probably don't have a chance to know? Or is it that the blame, like the formal accusation, is mismanagement of building this defensive lines in Kursk region that allowed Ukrainians to come in and take a lot of Russian territory, and then the Russian armed forces spent nearly a year pushing them back. So that particular circumstances related to the war and humiliation made him indefensible. What's your view?
So first, let me try to explain Starovoit's old ties to the Rothenberg family. And by the way, usually we're only mentioning the two Rothenberg brothers, the judo buddies of Putin, Boris and Arkady. But actually for the transportation industry, it's long been kind of more of the clan, because the son of Arkady Rothenberg, Igor Rothenberg, was gifted one of their largest projects in the Russian infrastructure. This is the kind of the toll system for the heavyweight trucks that collects the pay from them as they go via the federal roads. So, and this was the project that was awarded to Igor Rotenberg's company by Rosavtodor, actually headed by Roman Starovoit. So, as you already mentioned, another open secret, the Rotenbergs basically control all major infrastructure construction in Russia. Like, we're talking everything, not only highways and bridges, but also the gas pipelines, which is very important and very profitable, of course. And when we're talking highways and bridges, we include some of the most expensive projects in Russian history and the most politically important, like the bridge to the annexed Crimea. It was also awarded without any tender procedures to the company of Arkady Rotenberg. So, as for the connections of Starovoit to Rotenbergs, by the time Starovoit became the head of Rosavtodor, this federal government body that oversees road construction, the Rotenbergs had already become like the infrastructure tsars in Russia. So whoever was to step into this role at Rosavtodor actually had to work closely with Rotenbergs. And this relationship wasn't exactly like the relationship of partnership, the relationship of equals. It was more like boss and client dynamic. So actually, the Rotenbergs have the real power. They have the real resource. They have the access to Vladimir Putin. They have the money. And of course, they offer some perks to the bureaucrats working with them. And they offer some protection, but to a point. So the connections to Rotenbergs, this Krisha, this cover by Rotenbergs, does not guarantee any special position in the system, especially for someone like Starovoit, because he's not someone who is their close friend, who is their relative or whatever. He's just some bureaucrat who happened to be connected to them. Maybe back in his St. Petersburg times. So his bureaucratic career actually started in St. Petersburg in the year 2000s. And most likely he got acquainted to the Rotenberg family back in St. Petersburg. But this doesn't make him such a close connection. So Starovoit was very well placed, that's for sure. He was plugged in with the help of Rotenbergs as well, but he wasn't their guy. Like, in the sense they would be willing to take risks to protect him, and especially not during wartime when the stakes are higher, when there is the invasion of the Ukrainian forces into the Kursk region and so on. And so with such high stakes, naturally, you're not so interested in protecting someone not really important to you, you being Rotenbergs. So I think maybe the bigger question is like this, like, can the Rotenbergs still protect the people they really want to protect, they really need? Or maybe their influence is weaker than the influence of the security services. In other words, like, in case something happens, in case there is some conflict, like, who would be more convincing to Putin? The old judo buddies, the old friends, or the guys from the security services, from the FSB, whom he relies so much upon? And for now, I guess that this question is still wide open. So I don't think that Starovoit actually could expect Rotenbergs to step in such a situation.
I think that we are seeing, and you are describing, Margarita, a broader trend here. So we see a string of cases in the Russian elite after beginning of the war in 2022 that being a part of powerful clan doesn't give you any protection. Like, the most important example that I know both of you have spent a lot of time analyzing and writing about is this clan around former defense minister Sergei Shoigu, who is now put into an honorary retirement as the secretary of the Security Council. But people around him are now smashed in courtrooms. Like, the most visible example is the former Deputy Defense Minister Timur Ivanov, like a guy who had a very lavish lifestyle, this Brioni-made military uniform, and all of the perks of being a member of the elite, like this cartoonish civilian general. Now he got, 14 years behind the bars? And it seems that Sergei Shoigu cannot protect these people. So, Farida, what does it tell you how the rules of the game are changing for the Russian elite? And most importantly, do we know what the new rules are? Are there any new rules, or the bureaucrats and members of the elite have to leave and navigate an environment where the rules are not announced? All rules are definitely broken. And now it's this unpredictable and very toxic and stressful environment for them.
Yeah, you're right. These rules are unwritten. And the main skill you need if you're a part of the system is to know how to read the signals coming from above. And I would say that the signals have certainly changed. And I would say that the role of one man's mood increased incredibly. And so did the role of chaos. I'll explain it later, but first I would like to follow the timeline of recent years. So prior to the war in Ukraine, the convictions of high-ranking officials were really rare. There were not so many cases, and they did not begin immediately after the full-scale invasion. Actually, there was an informal moratorium on such cases before the 2024 so-called presidential elections. And a lot of people in the elite were already shaken by the war itself. They were sanctioned, they lost their assets in the West. So obviously Putin didn't want to disturb them even more before the elections so that they would pass smoothly. But after the 2024 elections, everything changed. And that's when the purge of top officials in the defense ministry started. And this purge was followed by dozens of other cases against officials and businessmen with extreme speed. And the main events for which people are being punished now are setbacks in the war. But also the important thing here, I think, is that those elections of 2024 presidential elections, it was Putin's fifth term, these elections, they were the first to run in accordance with the new constitution that Putin changed for himself to stay in power forever. So basically, they were the first to be completely illegal. And as a result, Russia turned fully into dictatorship. And at this point, Vladimir Putin is a monarch with absolute power, and he is the law, and he is the rules. The Russian system never had real checks and balances, but now even the remains of civil society or independent media or anything else is gone. And the country is under the rule of Putin, his security services, and also chaos. Yes, of course, Putin has to still keep the balance and keep the system working. If you scare everyone off and don't give any perks, no one's going to work, right? But keeping the balance and continuing to be the supreme arbiter is getting harder and harder amidst the war. And Putin focusing all of his attention on the battlefield, on relationships with Trump and all things Ukraine, etc. And here chaos enters the room. And his security services are doing whatever they want, as do actually other players. All of them are taking risks and testing the limits in their fight for power and resources, while the supreme leader is too busy to pay attention. So I would say the bottom line here is that we should not underestimate how many things are now dependent on one man's mood and spirit. If Putin is angry and he wants blood, there will be blood, and there is no escape.
There is one more element that I want to bring into this conversation. So we all witnessed since the beginning of the war a string of very mysterious suicides that are ravaging the Russian elite. There are more than 20 cases now, depending how you count, of very weird instances where senior people, mostly in finance and energy industry, taking their own life or life of their family members, even being outside of Russia, like this former chief financial officer of Novatek, who allegedly killed his wife and his daughter before taking his own life in Spain. How does that change the mood in the elite? Do people connect the dots between the draconian prison terms, no protection from Yakrisha, these very mysterious suicides that really don't get explained by the Russian investigative bodies. What are your sources telling you, Farida, and how do you read that situation?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's probably inevitable, to link those mysterious deaths of top managers of energy companies and Starovoit's suicide. Some people call it an assassination, but, I think, well, first, none of the people who we spoke to, they did not express any doubts about the official version that Starovoit actually killed himself. And another thing is that I think the pattern here is a bit different. So Starovoit he was not associated with the energy sector, and his body was found in a public space. And dozens of journalists and other people attended the scene. His gun was found nearby. So there are not a lot of, hallmarks of a state-sponsored assassination. And from what we know, Russian security services prefer to act covertly. They like means like poisoning and something like that more. So, of course, it's hard to trust the information coming from Russian law enforcement, but still, I think in this case, official version is closer to truth. But, from what we heard from the people in the system, this act of Starovoit, it kind of showed a way out, strange as it may seem. And I think it just shows the level of tension in the system. I know that it may sound a little cheesy, but people are really comparing the fear. I mean, it's obvious that we are not in Stalin's era level of repression, right? But people still compare, people in the system, they really compare the fear that they're experiencing right now with the fear that probably the nomenclatura of Stalin's era experienced.
I think that one more fear that many people in the elite are experiencing now, particularly those who are not bureaucrats but owners of businesses, is this reprivatization drive. The cases where property that was acquired throughout this very murky era of 1990s, where a lot of fortunes have been made honorably, like new fortunes, particularly new sectors of the economy. But a lot of them are rooted in this privatization drive of the 90s, where rules really didn't exist and people managed to cut corners and build large empires. A lot of these assets are now taken back by the states using justification from something that happened 20 years ago, quarter century ago, and a lot of assets are changing hands that must be adding to this compounding effect. So, Margarita, what's going on there? Is it just opportunism by some mid-level people in the security services and their business partners, or is it something that's systemic and sanctioned by the Kremlin, or as Farida would say, by Mr. Putin himself?
We'll get to this issue, whether this is systemic, but let me start from the word we're using very often, this reprivatization. And the thing is that what's happening is actually wider. So I would call it the redistribution of assets through nationalization. So let me explain. Like most of the assets that the Russian state has seized since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine weren't actually those 90s privatized state enterprises, the ones you described, just like this murky era of the 90s privatization. Although, yes, there are some cases like that, and actually numerous cases like that, but this is not the majority. So the thing is that more often the Russian state has been going after businesses that were actually created from scratch, that were private from the start, or the ones that bought some assets that were privatized in the 90s, but bought them like 10 years after privatization and bought them completely legally, not on those shady tender procedures that were the privatization of the 90s. So what we're seeing is like the seizure of different private assets, not only those privatized in the 1990s. I think that's very important. And this isn't the typical nationalization in some, Western terms. So when we hear nationalization, we might think about, France in the 1980s, where the state took entire industries in order to carry out some policy. But in Russia, there is no economic strategy about that. There is no clear strategy. The assets that are seized come from very different sectors. Think about the car dealer, Rolf. What for does the state need the car dealer? It's not some strategic military factory. So there is no clear economic strategy. And the state doesn't actually claim that it wants to strengthen its control over those sectors, because a lot of government officials are now saying that those seized assets will be privatized again, and even as soon as possible. So there seems to be some coherent economic logic behind what's happening. But this is a very good question, whether this is systemic, whether this is centralized. And I've talked about this a lot with Russian lawyers involved in these nationalization cases, and even with some of the now ex-owners whose businesses were seized. These were mid-sized companies. And I was asking, did you have an impression that this was all orchestrated, that the prosecution acts on some instructions from the above? There was no unanimous answers, and there was no hard proof that this is orchestrated. I don't know, directly from the Kremlin or from the presidential administration or from the FSB and Lubanka or whatever. But we do have some data, and we can draw some conclusions from it. I'll get to it and I'll try to be short, but I think there's another point that needs some clarification because of the peculiarities of the Russian law and of the Russian wartime law enforcement. So Russian law actually does allow for nationalization in the cases where the assets are considered strategically important. And this law about nationalization, there is the law about that, it states that the ex-owner should be compensated. And the thing is that this law has never been used. This law has never been used in the entire post-Soviet Russian history, and it's not used now in this wave of nationalizations when dozens of companies are seized every year since 2023. So there were about 10 companies seized in 2022, and then it all accelerated. So what's actually happening is something else. So all these seizures are kind of the punishments for the ex-owners. So the state takes these companies not because it needs them for some policies, but because the owners are accused of something, whatever, corruption, illegal privatization back in the 90s, or some other violations the prosecutors kind of discover, although this violation could have been in place for decades. So the logic of the prosecutors, the entire business was illegal. So the state has to step in, strip this criminal owner of their assets in order to right this wrong. But how do we know whether this is some prosecutors being too active, or whether this is systemic? There is some noteworthy trend about that. Most of the cases of the seizure of big assets are initiated by the federal prosecution, not the local prosecution in the regions where the seized companies operate, but the federal prosecution. And the federal prosecution is evidently more or less controlled from the federal center. Second of all, there is one case. This was the nationalization in the chemical industry. And 2 years ago, one of my sources shared with me a letter. It was a letter from some Rostec guys to Vladimir Putin. And this letter suggested nationalizing some of the chemical industry plants because it kind of provides some goods for the state interests in the chemical industry. And so on this document, there was the handwritten resolution by Vladimir Putin. It was quite shady. It was look into it, deal with it, ensure that the interests of the state are protected. But we can know for sure that he's personally involved, at least in some of these cases. And perhaps the question here is whether he actually wants to act as a referee, as an arbiter, like Farida mentioned in this big political corruption cases, but maybe the same concerns nationalization. So whether Putin wants to be the referee between the security services, the Siloviki, if we're speaking wider, and the businessman who still have kind of some personal access to him or to someone from Putin's inner circle. And finally, there is some interesting pattern in the data that I recently noticed. So one Russian law firm, it's called NSP, recently compiled a kind of a database of all the nationalization trials that were in place since 2022. There are around 100 cases. There are 100 in like 3 years. And I tried to analyze it for our latest newsletter issue. And you can check out the diagram that we used to kind of summarize the most important conclusions from this analysis. And there is one thing that stands out. There has been a very sharp drop in the cases where this illegal privatization, as the prosecutors call it, was used as the official reason for the seizure. So there were like dozens of these cases in 2023, 2024, but in 2025, there are practically no cases with this official reason. Meanwhile, the cases where like corruption or the fight on corruption is used like the official pretext for seizure, the number of such cases has increased and very significantly. And I think this is not just a coincidence that first the prosecutors were so eager to look into privatization, and then all of a sudden the prosecutors were more interested in the corruption. I think this may be the clue that suggests that this is orchestrated, that this isn't some random initiatives of single prosecutors. So I think what we're seeing is at least something that Putin doesn't want to be stopped, that Putin is okay with. So you guys want to redistribute those assets. Some guys want profitable assets under their control. Okay, deal with it yourselves. Maybe do not involve me too much into that. And I'll look into more important issues. Or maybe the day when he's in the mood, like Farida says, like a lot of depends on his spirits. He's eager to be engaged and to look into some cases. The system centered around one man influences every aspect, including the aspect of property rights protection that was non-existent even before the war. And now businessmen cannot expect their rights to be preserved in any way.
Before we wrap up, I have one question to you, Farida. So given everything what you've so aptly described, this level of unpredictability, old rules are gone, your Krusha is not necessarily protecting you, your assets may be taken away, your career might be destroyed, and then the boss, the arbiter, is completely involved into the battlefield, trying to micromanage the troops, and is really detached from running this very complex system. A lot of people might be frustrated, but there was this hope from the very beginning of the war that there will be some form of pushback from the elite, that the elite members, some of them have profited from the war effort, but the old life is gone where they could travel for their vacations or weekends very easily to their little dachas, like little vacation properties to southern France or London. Like that all is gone. Your life inside Russia is threatened. So what will be the reaction? Will we see any form of pushback and opposition to this, or people will just continue to dive into their private collections of expensive Burgundy or Bordeaux vintages, drink themselves to kind of semi-conscious condition, and describe suicide of Starovoit as an honorable way out?
Yeah, Starovoit's suicide definitely revealed some of the real tension within the system. And you're right that Russian officials, they can no longer flee their problems. They cannot immigrate, and continue their lives abroad quietly. And this is not just a result of Western sanctions, because Russian officials are de facto banned from leaving the country. And this ban works the strongest in the government. So government ministers are literally banned from having a vacation, even in a so-called friendly countries, like, I don't know, Turkey or Kazakhstan or whatever. So they only can live and work on Russian territory. And many of our sources have complained that they feel trapped. But still, I think a very telling moment was how people actually said their goodbyes to Starovoit. I mean, even officials who knew him for years, they were nervous about expressing their feelings in public. And they told us that if you show softness, they will consider you a traitor. So everyone realized that Putin was probably not very happy about the suicide. And because obviously things are not going well if your ministers shoot themselves, right? And this the Kremlin confusion was, I think, very well encapsulated by a story run by the state news agency RIA Novosti that reported that Putin had sent a funeral wreath to the memorial event. And then a few hours later, they withdrew the story, claiming that it was an error. But still, some government officials came to a public memorial service in Moscow for Starovoit. And a source told us that there was no ban from Kremlin on ministers to attend, but they were asked not to talk to journalists, to keep it quiet so that everything would blow over soon. And they all actually kept quiet. They did show up. Some of them did show up. Some of his colleagues who he worked with, who he met at government meetings, but they all kept quiet. Not a single person opened their mouths and expressed condolences. Not a single message was published by the government or the Kremlin about what happened. And I think it says a lot about the, sort of potential for change among these people. And even though they feel trapped in the system, and it seems logical that they should try to set better rules for themselves, but it's not how the system works right now. And no one cares about what they think or what they feel. And they're mostly meant to accept all the decisions of the leader. And given that they were not brave enough to even open a mouth and express condolences to the family of their late colleague, I think we can judge of their potential for change, for action.
Final question. Well, the officials and members of the elite are trapped in Russia, but we are not. We chose to go into exile with the first days of the war. I met you, Margarita and Farida, back in Moscow days when you were all very respected journalists working for back then independent news media, respected across the board. You were definitely not loyalists and part of the system and media that were state-friendly or state-owned, but really well-plugged and knowing what's going on. You're outside of Russia for the last 3 years. You are publishing a very successful, very informative newsletter on Substack. We will put the link into the show notes, and I encourage everybody to subscribe. It's really a terrific source of information and analysis on Russia. And we are grateful that you are appearing on Carnegie's platform. That's always an honor to have you. Tell me, how does that new environment that we've talked about, the state of fear, paranoia, learned helplessness among your sources affect your work from the outside? Margarita, I start with you.
Thank you for remembering the old days. So, of course, I feel myself detached from a lot of sources that are trapped inside Russia. A lot of my former sources back from Vedomosti days are no longer in government service. They managed to escape before the war, and they're very happy with this. Some of them are now working in some international organizations in the so-called friendly countries and prefer to pretend that there was no government career. There was nothing like that in Russia. I'm an international bureaucrat, no less and no more. Some of them still do communicate. The aftermath of Starovoit's suicide was very telling about their mood, because I have one source who is very friendly with me. Like, we spoke some time ago and he was so happy to hear. He was like, oh, remember the old days? Remember we took coffee and I told you about what's happening in the transportation industry. Maybe we could meet for coffee someday in some neutral country, who knows? But when I asked him, like, how are you feeling about the Starovoit death? Not for the quote, just between us. He was very laconic. He only wrote, in shock, nothing to say, write me later. So this is a very sensitive topic. This is dangerous for them to communicate. And I do understand how risky their position might be, even when you're using some special messengers, etc. So yes, you feel detached. You do not feel the prestige of this job in the eyes of bureaucracy that used to be back before the war, long before the war, actually. But still, some of them do communicate, and this is very important. This is very useful, because I'm sure that we need to make this very closed and very dangerous Russian system at least a tiny bit more open to the world, for the world to understand and to interpret correctly what's happening inside, and to make the right conclusions about how to deal with this closed, dangerous system.
Farida?
Yeah, I totally agree with Margarita. And I would also say that it's an incredible challenge, to write about Russian system, not being there, not being able to go to the places and see the people in their natural habitat. You don't feel it on the tips of your fingers anymore. And it's really hard. And I think we should be honest to our readers and to ourselves that we actually know much less than we don't know. And there are so many things that we don't know about and we are unable to learn about. And there are, tiny crumbs that we're getting from there. And of course, it's partly because it's really dangerous for the people from the system to leak something, to say something, to tell about something truly substantial and important. But, still have people who, I think they have this old school 90s attitude towards journalists, and they don't consider us a threat, or a threat to themselves, or a threat to the society. And that's probably the feeling that drives them to still, keep some connections with some journalists. I also think that the COVID pandemic actually, it brought a lot of, bad things to our lives. Including us as journalists, because that was the time when Russian system actually started closing more and more. It didn't start at the beginning of the war. It had started earlier. But, those times, I think they taught people in the system to actually use online messengers more often, and to not just to communicate to journalists, but to communicate to each other. And I think if there is a good thing coming from all of the pandemic, that's, this habit to using digital platforms, a digital means of communication. And I think it helped us journalists a lot, actually.
Thank you so much. I think that I cannot agree more that there is an increasing amount of information that we don't know, or we need to be honest that we could not be sure about interpreting the internal motivations. So we see the external effects or some events happening, but we cannot be sure what exactly is driving them and what are the triggers and who is pushing the buttons. But it's still important to try to penetrate this black box. It's not entirely black still, and information is there and available, and it's possible to analyze it and really make this system that's waging this horrible war against Ukraine and that is really threatening, its own population and its neighbors increasingly, that analysis and information is still available. Thank you so much, both Farida and Margarita, for your contribution to the field. And thanks for being today with me.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for your insightful questions. It was great talking to you.
Thank you so much, Sasha. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for today. I will remind everybody that if you don't want to miss any episode of this podcast, you should hit the subscribe button. We're very eager to hear what you think about the current dynamics and all the topics that we've discussed with Farida and Margarita. Leave us a comment, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with the last episode of this season before the summer break. Take care.